Good evening. Have you ever entered into a relationship hoping that the relationship will be a loving, caring, lasting relationship forever? Just to find that very shortly it soured and turned to unhappiness. God created us for relationship. He created us for a relationship with Him and with each other. The sad thing is that on this planet, we are challenged in terms of relationships. The question is why? Why is it so difficult for us to really hear what the other one is saying, or at least for the other one to hear what I'm saying? I remember that my wife and I got married, I think 33 years ago. It will be in December the 19th coming. And I desired to have a marriage that was made in heaven, a marriage that would be happy. I think that I am a fairly good articulator. I can fairly effectively communicate, I hope. So I said to my wife, remember, that is when there's a bit of conflict, a bit of tension between us. I said to her, just remember, I don't waste words. When I speak a certain word, I mean exactly what it means. It took me a few years to realize that although culturally we're from the same background, and although linguistically we use exactly the same mother tongue, we grew up in different homes. And the word or the meaning that I place to a certain word is not the meaning that she places to the same word. Nor does she have the same baggage in her suitcase than what I have. This week's presentations is not so much focused on marital relationship or male-female relationship. It is more based on human relationship. And if you have married someone that is a fellow human being, yes, then these presentations will suit you as well. I'm going to take you tonight into a very painful part of my own life. And I'm going to disclose a fair bit about myself because then no one else has to feel threatened. But I need to warn you from the outset that as I am going to open up about my own life experience, it is going to trigger memories of your own life. You will, in actual fact, experience a schizophrenic moment. What do I mean by that? What do we know about schizophrenia? What is the common concept about schizophrenia? Is that we hear voices, don't we? And reality, as I'm going to speak tonight and tomorrow night and the night thereafter, in the back of your mind will be a parallel discussion running as I am speaking. You will not only hear me speak, you're going to hear your own mind trying to interpret what I say against the backdrop of your own past experience. So tomorrow night we're going to talk about why I can't hear what you're saying. You ready for it? You'll have to come back for that tomorrow night because I'm not going to give you the information tonight. Tonight, the question is, what is in your suitcase? I'm attending night classes for my master's degree, and it is the first night of a new semester, a new subject. The title of the subject is the contextualized self, the context in which my sense of self has been formed. Do you really know who you are? What has shaped you to be the person that you are? as we were waiting for our lecturer to arrive in our class, we're watching our clock, and there's a unspoken policy that if a lecturer is late 15 minutes for his class, you can go and you will not be marked late or absent because it's the lecturer that is absent. So we stand around waiting. I'm fairly new in this institution, so I don't know the lecturers. All I know is his name and the subject that I'm taking, but I don't know how he looks like. So I stand around with some of the other students, and here comes into the class a gentleman with a suitcase in his hand. You know these kind of suitcases that you go on holiday with? He walks into the classroom with a suitcase in his hand, and everyone looks up. There's a silence that falls in the classroom. I look at the guy's head and his hair. It looks as though he had his fingers in the electrical prog because it just stands all fuzzy out. Red, bushy, but thinning hair. And he comes up to the front of the class and he throws his suitcase, the one that you would go on a holiday with, throws it on the front desk. He flips it open, opens the lid, looks in, takes out an object out of the suitcase, looks at it, and he moves around in the class and he puts it in a corner. He comes back. There's not a word that he speaks to anyone in the class. He just goes on with his own business. He picks out another object out of the suitcase. He looks around and he places it somewhere else in the classroom, comes back to the suitcase, and it takes about 20 minutes to do this. By now, each one of us are sitting in our chairs, looking at the spectacle, wondering what is going on. Eventually, the gentleman comes back to the front of the class and he says, "Good evening, class. I am Dr. So-and-so. I'm the associate professor of this faculty. And this term, I'm going to introduce you, or tonight rather, I'm going to introduce you to whom I am." He says, "I want to remind you, as a therapist, you can never understand your client, not before you have discovered who you are." So he went to the first object that he had placed in the corner, picked it up, described the object, and he started to tell his life story that surrounded that object and the meaning of that object and how the events in his life has shaped him to be the person who he was. He went from object to object, took about close to 3/4 of an hour to tell parts of his life story. He came back to the front of the class. He said, "This term, I'm going to ask and invite each one of you to bring your suitcase into the class and to introduce yourself to the rest of the class." My friends, that is when the crisis hit my life. Because who was I? Why am I so sensitive to certain things that happen in my home, especially with people that are very close to me? Why is it that when my wife would use the word, "That was stupid," why is it that I'm so reactive, that I'm immediately angry, that I'm so defensive? Why is it that when she questions me on certain things, that I can't just stay calm and just be present and hear her out? Why do I go immediately over into a defensive mode? I had to go back to to my home, and I had to go and think and ponder. And the more I pondered about what I'm going to bring into my suitcase to the class, to introduce my class to who I am, the more the tension built up within me, to the point where my wife eventually said to me, "David, are you sure that it is wise for you to continue to study the subject? Don't you think that therapy is maybe not for you? You've become a monster." Who are you? And if I would invite you tonight, over this week, to go home and think a little bit about who you are, I just wonder, what would you bring in your suitcase? Because friends, as I thought about this, I realized that in my suitcase, I hold many memories of pain. I'm the second youngest of 5 children. I guess I grew up thinking that our family was normal. I thought that, there was times of happiness, there was times of sorrow. I guess that is happening in any family. But I remember always wondering whether I was an adopted child. It was interesting, after I buried my mother close to 2 years ago, I spoke to my siblings, and I said to them that I wanted to disclose something to them. We by now, as orphans, both our parents have died. And I said to my siblings that my entire life I felt as though I might have been an adopted child. Maybe they could shed any light whether it was so or not, since I'm the second youngest child. And my older sister jumped up and she said, "You too? Did you also feel like that?" There was favoritism in our home. Some of the kids were treated differently than others. If I would go back to my hometown, my home church where I grew up, and they would announce Sabbath morning that David Hope is taking the sermon today, everyone will think that my father got up out of the grave. Because they only knew my father as David Hope. And although I carried his name as my first name, my parents were proud to tell me that they deliberately chose not to use that name out of fear that my father would favor me above my older brother. My older brother was the favored one. And 2 years after I buried my dad, about 8 years ago, my brother came en route to New Zealand. Him and his wife came to visit us at our home then, living in Queanbeyan, just outside Canberra. And they were waiting up for me one night while I attended committee meetings. And when I arrived home just before midnight, my brother and his wife were waiting up for me because they were leaving the following day. And in our bit of a discussion, my brother said to me, "So, David, tell me, what did you inherit from Dad?" I made a joke. I said I inherited his underpants. Because after the funeral, Mum came to me and said, I had to fly back to Australia the same day after the funeral. She came to me and said, "Son," as I was packing my stuff, she said, "Dad hasn't used this underpants much. You can take it for yourself." I said, "Mum, thank you, but it's not going to fit me. I appreciate it. Give it to someone that it will fit." No, my brother said, what did you inherit from Dad?" I said to him, "Brother, 4 out of the 5 kids inherited. 4 out of the 5 kids were mentioned in the will. I was the one that was not mentioned. But surely you must have inherited something from Granddad," that is my maternal, my mother's father, No, brother. There was one person that inherited, and that was you. You mean you never inherited anything? No. How does that make a child feel? How does it make a child feel when they grow up with conditionality in terms of acceptance, affection, and a sense of belonging? When there's always a condition too. I remember as a young student at school, I always believed that I was the dummy. I was the one that would never excel. My brothers and my sisters were the ones that were bright and clever, and they were the ones that would excel. And that belief held me back from moving forward in life. I'm the only one in my family that ever went to university. The only one. None of the other bright ones did. But what was very interesting for me was that constantly, even through my undergraduate and postgraduate, my master's degree, I would start a new term always wondering whether I would be able to make it this term. So about a year before my mum passed away, I received and I'm sharing this not to bag my parents, but to make a point. I want to make it very clear to you tonight that if I ever had a chance to choose my own parents, I would choose exactly the two old people that was my parents. I would choose them without question. I'm sharing it because I want you to gain some insight into how the human mind works. Ellen White says that the greatest study is the study of understanding how the human mind works. Because I'm going to show you tonight that Satan is going to bring about injury to our mind so that he can try and destroy us. Not just us, our marriages, our relationship, our kids through us. I received in the mail from the university about a year before my mother passed away, received 2 envelopes about 2 months apart. And I'm not bragging about this, I'm trying to make a point. And I opened up the first envelope. It was a letter from the Chancellor of the University of Canberra that says, "Dear Mr. Haupt, congratulations. Your marks have been brought to my attention. And the university is happy to award you a lifelong membership to the Golden Key High Achievers Award." Let me explain to you what this is. It is an international award. Of over 300 universities, this award is only given to the top 15% of the academical achievers. Congratulations. I left it there. But when the second one came and I opened it up, it was from the chancellor, from the dean of the faculty that said, "Mr. Haupt, your marks have been brought to my attention, and the faculty is happy to award you with the Dean's Excellence Award." I phoned my mum up the Sunday morning as I normally would, and she answered on the other side. I checked whether she was okay. We chatted a little bit about this and that. And then I said, "Mum, there's something that I'd like to share with you. Mum, you remember all those years that you sat up with me till midnight trying to teach me maths and English?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Mum, it eventually paid off." "What do you mean?" And I told her about the 2 awards that I received. And there was a few seconds of silence. And then Mum responded. She said, "Son, let me tell you about the success of your brother in business." Not a word of, "Son, I thank God that He has been kind to you. Son, I'm proud of you. Nothing. I flew over. I was in the middle of running a depression program. Jim, it was 2 years, nearly 2 years. I asked the people if I could take a break, and because Mum was taken up into hospital. And I cared for her, took her out of hospital, cared for her, made sure that there was sufficient support for her. I said, Mum, I've got to go back. I've got public meetings running. I can only stay for a week. I spent every morning worshipping with her. Every afternoon I would feed her. Then I would have worship with her. Every evening I would feed her. I would have worship with her. It came to Wednesday, exactly a week. My flight was that afternoon late. My son had gone with me to visit his grandma. Early that morning, as I had worship with Mum, I said to her, Mum, I have to fly out. After I fed you lunchtime, I'll have to say goodbye because I've got to go back home. She just nodded her head. I fed her lunchtime. I gathered the family around the bed. I had worshipped with her. I knew it was the last time that I would ever see my mum on this side of eternity. I prayed for her. And then I bent over my mum and I took her in my arms and I said to her, Mum, I love you. I'll see you one day when Jesus comes. And there was silence. Mum, I love you. Nothing. I stepped aside. My son stepped into my position. He put his arms around his grandma. He says, Oma, the Afrikaans for grandma. He says, I love you. She said, I love you, son. I took her bags, put it in my brother-in-law's vehicle. And as he started the vehicle, I said to him, just hang on. I just need to run into the home again. I'll be back shortly. And I ran into the house, into my mum's room, and I just picked her up out of the bed. I just held her against my chest. I said, Mum, I love you. And she said, mm-hmm. I flew back a week later to bury my mum. My dear friends, my question that I'd like to ask you tonight is, whose voice are you hearing in the back of your head? Do you know what I'm talking about? That self-talk that constantly is holding us back from moving forward in our life. That schizophrenic moments. Whose voice is it that is controlling your life? I so desperately wanted the approval from my parents. I knew that they loved me. I just wondered whether they liked me. And I must confess tonight that I am a recovering workaholic. Not an alcoholic. I'm a recovering workaholic. Why? Because my entire life I knew that I had value. And I received value from Dad or from Mum when I worked hard. So working as a minister of religion, I never knew when was enough. I never knew when to switch off and when just to say, I have done enough work for one day. If you had asked the conference president, what is David's, can you please tell me one problem that you have with David? You know what his answer would be? I can't get him to stop working. I will work even until I fall flat on my face. I will actually, when I get sick, I will actually work harder. And who's the ones that suffer? My family, my wife, and my kids. Because in the back of my mind, the voices that speak in the back of my mind says you've got to work hard in order to attain value. I'd like to take you on some research that had been done by the Harvard Mastery of Stress study. They focused on college-aged young adults, and they wanted to look at what the impact of the impact of stress, family relational stress, has on young people. They found that 95% of subjects that they studied who used few positive words and related their parents low in parental caring had diseases diagnosed in midlife years. Now we're talking here about diseases like heart disease, cancer, stomach ulcers, duodenal ulcers, all different major health challenges. 95% of those people that had a low or few positive words for the relationship with their parents. A second study was done on a father-son relationship. They found that 82% of participants who had low warmth and closeness with their fathers had diagnosed diseases in midlife, compared only with 50% of those who had a high warmth and closeness score with their fathers. 82%. By the way, we here in a church Christian context, where does children build their concept about God? Can anyone tell me? What is the primary source of developing in your mind a concept of God? Father-child relationship. So I work with, years back, I worked in Cabramatta with drug addicts and prostitutes on behalf of the church. I developed a center under the umbrella of ADRA where we worked with these people. And when I work with young prostitutes and I talk to them about a Father God, they say to me, don't ever talk to me about him again, because he's no different to my father that sexually abused me from a very young age. The father-son relationship, 82% of participants with a low warmth. I've done that one, sorry. The Johns Hopkins University, they in their study found that the best predictor of who would get cancer decades later in their midlife years was the closeness of a father-son relationship early in life. Fathers. There's a few fathers here, am I right? There are young people that needs to know that you have unconditionally accepted them in order for them to be able to live a healthy life for the future, in order for them to be a stable person to take over the reins of the church when you are too old to do that. The longest longitudinal study that was ever done on any young people was done on the Seventh-day Adventist Church and was recorded in the book by the researcher Roger Dudley. The question that he researched was, why does Seventh-day Adventist young people leave the church and what to do about it? He found that they were not in disagreement with the teaching of the church. You know what he found? The dads were wonderful at church, but when they arrived back home, there was a monster that came loose as the tie came off. Even the cat and the dog disappeared because that person they knew. No, that wasn't his research. That's just my addition to it. The focus on the mother-son and the mother-daughter relationship, they found that 91% of participants who did not perceive themselves as having a warm relationship with their mothers had serious diagnosed diseases in midlife, including coronary artery diseases, high blood pressure, duodenal ulcers, alcoholism, as compared only to 45% of those who had perceived themselves as having a warm relationship with their mothers. We don't talk about this research. Friends, we walk away from it, but often what we find is that we carry those baggage with us our entire life. Tomorrow night, I'm going to challenge you to have a new look at what you have in your suitcase and to ask the question, does this really belong to me? And then I'm going to give you a method of reclaiming your life. It has been a long journey for me. But I had to work on myself in order to be there with Dad 8 years ago when I went to his bedside and stayed with him the final 5 days of his life. I already knew what was in the world, and I did not care. It wasn't anymore to gain his approval. Dad called me to his side of his bed. I promised him, I said, Dad, I will not leave you. You will not die alone. That is my motto. You will not die alone. I will stay with you right up to the end. Dad called me. I was sitting on the chair next to his bed. He said, son, there's something important that I need to ask you. I said, what is it, Dad? He said, son, will you please go to the solicitor? There's one last thing that I'd forgotten to put in my will. You're the only one that I can trust. Will you go? I said, sure, Dad. What is it? I said, I want you to go to your solicitor, to my solicitor. My father had a business building where he used to run a business out. He said, I've not put that in the will yet. I want that property to be given to your older brother. Will you let my solicitor know? I said, sure, Dad. I called the solicitor. Mum came. I took the car. I drove to the solicitor's office. I told him what my father had asked me to convey to him. He said to me, David, we can ignore that this discussion has taken place. Do you know what is written in the will? I said, I don't care. It's not about me. It is Dad's choice. He said, do you know what's written in the will? I can make as if I've not heard anything, and you'll be able to get something. My father's final will and testament is that building must go to my older brother. I want you to write it in. That is my father's will. I went back to Dad. I said, Dad, you can now rest. It is done. And I stayed with Dad. Not anymore for my sake, for his sake. Because I've gone through the journey of discovering who I am. Friends, the focus on the mother and a father's lack of warmth. They found that 100% of the participants who rated both their mothers and their fathers low in warmth and closeness 35 years earlier had diseases in their midlife. Why? As I researched to try and work out who I was and what was in my baggage, I came upon this research from the object relations theory people. They believe that as humans we are originally motivated not to seek anxiety reduction, but to seek relatedness, attachment, and connection to others. In other words, our greatest need is not to reduce our stress and anxiety. Our greatest need is to feel that we belong. We will often enter into a toxic relationship purely hoping that someone will say, I care for you. We often find that women will return back to an abusive relationship, will return back to the husband that keeps on beating her up. For what purpose? Hoping that maybe next time he will change and that he will say, you do hold value for me. They continue, they say, however, if a severe injury is inflicted to the self, to the formation of self, and its relations early in life, then our search for that connectedness will deteriorate into self-preoccupation and defensive rage. So when an injury to the development of self happened, to those earliest relationships, our primary caregivers, especially mum and dad, which is our primary caregivers, when an injury happens there, then we'll find that we will deteriorate into an awareness, an over-awareness of self. These internalized perceptions and impressions are rather enduring. They serve as a kind of cognitive schema or a subject landscape that shapes our relationship with others later in life. What does it mean? It means that when that kind of injury takes place in your life, over your eyes are placed tinted glasses that distort every relationship that you will make later in life. The sad thing is that most people will not even realize that they carry tinted glasses. So I would sit at university, and as the lecturer is busy sharing a concept, my mind would be racing. I will be wondering whether, if I have something to share, if I would speak out, whether they would laugh at me for the way that I use the English language, whether my tenses would be in the right order, if I will use the right tenses. So in the back of my mind, I start to work out what I need to share, and I construct my sentence. And when I'm ready to speak, I take a deep breath and I want to move forward with what I want to present. And then I realized that I've already moved on to the third or the fourth concept. I've in actual fact missed out a fair bit because of the voices that I hear. Because I know that it has to be perfect before I speak. Whose voices am I hearing? The last sermon that Dad heard me preach, the final one that he would be present, he would not be able to hear because he would be in the coffin. But the final sermon that Dad could hear, we walked out of the church, got back into Dad's car, And he turned to me and he said, "Son, that was a good sermon. But why did you use that word? That sentence construction was wrong. You should have used this word instead of that one." Was my father a linguist? No. But Dad had never learned how to just say, "Son, thank you. God used you today." I want to share with you a model of understanding self and self-value. The way that I have just described, I'm going to put it into a model form. Is that okay? And I want you to reflect. I want you to have your schizophrenic moment. I want you to, as I share my story, I want you to reflect it against your experience and your story. When I share this, and this is part of my research for my master's degree, and when I present it, there's about 90% in my audience that sit there in utter silence. They come up afterwards and they say to me, "David, what you've presented tonight was the first time that someone gave me words to help me understand what I have felt all my life long." But there will be a small minority that will say, "You lost me tonight. We don't understand what you spoke about." And I would say to that group of people, can I venture to say that you grew up with a very stable, loving relationship, unconditional affection at home? And they would say, "Yes, that's true." So that is why you can't understand what I'm saying. But for the majority of people, they sit expressionless, looking at what I present, too afraid that others might notice what is going on in their heart as they reflect on my story and remember their story. I'm calling this the Hellenistic worldview of self. Why do I call it the Hellenistic worldview? Hellenistic means Greek. In the Greek mind, if I want to understand this watch of mine, the Greek mind would look at it, will realize that there's some screws at the back. They'll take a little screwdriver, start to unscrew it, take everything apart and dissect it, and then when they start to put it back all together and they press the button and it continues to work, they will say, "I know it." The Hebrew mind is not trying to explain, is not trying to dissect. The Hebrew mind just has a relationship with it. I learned this concept in my studies in theology, and as I was working with people with pathology, the problems that they face in their life, it suddenly one day just clicked that the human mind has those two views as well in terms of self. So let me share with you my world. That is my world that I'm going to share about. I'm at the center. In the Greek view, I'm at the center of my world. Someone said to me they don't use Apple products. Why? Because Apple is all about I. And that is very typical for the Hellenistic mind, because the world centers around me. Have you met people like that? A guy sitting with a group of people, talking to them. They were talking about his achievements in life, and at a certain point, this guy said to his audience, "Look, that's enough from me. I don't want us to talk anymore about me. So let's talk about you guys. What is your thoughts about the latest book that I've written?" Still about him, isn't it? The first relationships in my life was my parents. And it is when parents unconditionally accepts their children, unconditionally gives affection to their children, unconditionally provides a sense of belonging to their children, that the child would know that they have great sense of worth and value. Mothers, what I'm going to say next is not intended to make you feel guilty, but it is to state a fact about why you might be sensitive. Modern research have shown that already from the third trimester of pregnancy, that when a mother is exposed to intense stress, that her body will release the stress hormone cortisol, which will be equally in the bloodstream of her young fetus, the unborn baby. In the mother, a prolonged exposure to the stress hormone cortisol can eventually trigger cancer development. In the unborn child, in the fetus, it alters the growth of the brain neurons and alters it permanently. And will affect the child in three ways. The way that the child would deal with stress, the way that the child would view themselves, and because of the former two, the way that the child will one day build relationships. My own wife suffered with severe depression in its worst form, the psychiatrist had said, that he had ever seen. It's interesting that my son, whom she carried during that time, is today a young engineer, but he battles to deal with stress. Interesting. When a parent would conditionally treat a child, in other words, we will give you a hug if you do things right, but if you don't do things right, we'll shun you, turn our back upon you. When a parent deals with a child conditionally in terms of a sense of belonging, that child will grow up always wondering whether they are good enough, whether they are good enough to be accepted. And what is interesting is that Satan knows this earliest injury. And what happens, this person becomes super conscious and sensitive towards the same pathology in other relationships. So when peers or their own siblings act in a very similar way, they start to believe that those actions are reflecting their own value. Then they meet a spouse in their life who maybe themselves have grown up in a very similar relationship, who also is seeking for approval and affection, and therefore is unable to give unconditionality. And the negative thought about self becomes cemented, and it starts to form the foundation of how they start to build relationship. Let me just explain what I mean by conditionality or unconditionality. Christ had the ability to love the sinner but hating sin. As human beings, we've got a difficulty in making that differentiation. We shun each other often because we disagree with the lifestyle that someone lives. Over the years that I've worked in Australia, I've worked with some of the most marginalised people. I've worked in Cabramatta, which is the drug capital was the drug capital of Australia. Right there, I set up a centre under the umbrella of ADRA. And we developed a new program, new approach to work with these people. Often young people would come in to my office, and although there's no one else around, the door's closed, they would whisper in my ear. They would say to me, "I'm one of you." And I would whisper back, "What do you mean?" And they'd say, I'm also an Adventist. What gave them the courage to speak out? They discovered that although we disagree with their lifestyle, we love them in spite of. And that unconditionality had brought about in many of those people that they came to the point and said, I want to live up to that value that you've reflected to me. I want to follow the Jesus that I saw through you. Oh, my friends, what's going to happen if our churches would be filled by people that intentionally would look at people not in terms of what they do wrong, but rather in terms of the value that God has attached to their life, and be willing not to condone, but to support that person towards healing and spiritual health. What is very interesting is that those earliest memories starts to be reflected in our community. We start to become acutely aware about the negativity of people in our community, and we become reactive to that, even towards our church. I speak most weekends in another congregation. And as I work with people in our congregations and I share my research, people afterwards come up to me and say, I was fighting the whole time my tears because what you were talking about me. Thank you for giving words to how I feel deep inside. But thank you for reflecting how God is willing to treat me as well. We even think and perceive God through the lenses, the tinted lenses of my past. My friends, what is wrong with this model? What is wrong with this view of self? Can anyone tell me? We can see that this is the way that we perceive ourselves, don't you? What is wrong with it though? What is wrong with it is that we base our value upon the opinions and the behaviors of unreliable sources. I was hoping that my parents would reflect my worth and my value. Were they really stable enough to be able to do that? I was hoping that my wife would be able to reflect my worth and my value through the way that she would deal with me. But guess what? My wife came out of an alcoholic home. She was battling her own demons. Her father was an alcoholic. He lied about his age when the Second World War broke out. He was but a mere 15 years of age, and he went to the Second World War. He was captured by the Italians twice and incarcerated. He got away from it, and he saw too much, far more than what the 15-year-old boy should have seen. And in order for him to drown out what he saw, he turned to the bottle. So my wife grew up in a home where Dad loved the bottle more than what he loved them. Is my wife really stable enough to be able to speak my worth and my value? By the way, let's turn it around. Am I stable enough to speak my wife's worth and value? It worked both ways, my friend. So I want you to picture the person that really gets under your skin at church or in your community or in your home. You know what I'm talking about. Don't shout it out. Just keep it in your mind. Most probably, that person is battling with a low sense of self-worth and value. And as I said yesterday morning, when I'm deflated in my sense of worth and value, there's only 3 responses that I will react to. One of them, I will either fight. Do you know someone that always blows up and fights? Or I will withdraw. Do you know someone that instead of coming to you and talk to you about issues would rather just withdraw? Stay away from church? Or the third option, that is my option. That's the way that I used to deal with things at home. And if my wife was here, she would stand up and say, David speaks the truth. I would first attack. And then I've shown my true colors that I've no value, and then I go and withdraw. A couple that had been separated for 3 years, living apart, was brought into my counseling room by the wife's mother, who heard about my work and said, will you please work with my daughter and son-in-law? Try and see if you can bring them together. And I was working with them for a while. And one day, I turned to the wife, and I'm sharing this with their permission. I turned to the young wife. I said to her, tell me, as a child, when you grew up, were there times that you just felt as though you had no value? No one cared about you. You didn't have any value in the home. She said, yes, I felt like that often. I said, what method did you use to deal with it? She at first didn't understand what I was trying to get at. And when I spoke to her about these 3 options, she said, oh, that makes it very, very easy. She said, it is clear. I would withdraw. I said, what would you do? She said, I would go and hide under my bed, or I would hide in the cupboard, or I would go outside and hide. I said, for what purpose? She thought for a while and she said, yeah, it was just instinctive that I'd done it. But now thinking about it, I guess I went and hid, hoping that someone would come and search for me. I said, what would it have meant if someone came and searched for you? She said, I guess that I'd value. I said to her, did anyone ever come to search for you? She's already an adult, in her late 30s. The tears well up in her eyes as she reflects about her childhood years. She says, Mum never came searching for me. Dad did a few times. I turned to the husband. I knew already the answer. I said to the husband, tell me, what method did you use? He said, now listening to my wife, it's easy. Yes, I'm also withdrawal. I also withdraw. I said, guys, let me ask you a question. In your marriage, what method did you use? We use the same method that failed us as children. We use it in our adult life, in our adult relationships. And although it failed us as children, we do exactly the same, hoping to gain a different outcome. So the wife is invited by her boss, who's a medical doctor, to come with him on an overseas trip. She comes home and says to her husband, my boss has invited me to go on an overseas trip with him, a medical conference. What a great honor. The husband says, I don't like this. I don't trust this sleazy old man. I've never trusted. He's just after your body. Don't go. She said, okay, but come then with me. We can spare that money. Come with me. She says in his mind, in her mind, if he comes with me, I know that he loves me and that I've got value in his eyes. He sits in himself and he says, if she don't go, I know that she really then loves me. The time comes for the trip. The taxi comes and picks her up and takes her to the airport. The whole time she waits and she looks around to see whether he's going to follow her to come and fetch her. She waits for the final call before going through the gate, hoping that her husband would rush through the departure hall and yell out to her and say, "Stop, come home with me." She says to me, "I would have dropped the ticket right there, because knowing that he loves me is what I've been waiting for to know my entire life." He sits at home saying to himself, "If she really loves me, that same taxi will bring her back. She will not go." 2 weeks later, she flies back into Australia, and he's already moved out of the house. The games we play because of what we have in our suitcase. Oh, my friends, I better rush to finish. We make use of a satanic formula. Listen very carefully. A satanic formula that says that my value is equal to my performance plus other people's approval of it. So if I work hard enough, if I speak well enough over the next few days, and you approve of what I say, then I'll know that I've got value. The pressure's on you, friends, to make me feel good. Wait a minute. What are we talking about? We are talking about a search for significance, which creates an addictive behavior, which is called approval addiction. And that, my friends, instills within us workaholism in my life. Can you see it? A satanic formula where we become acutely aware of self, and the words I, me, myself becomes predominantly used in our vocabulary. Do you know that for people that are in mental institutions, the words I, me, myself are used 9 times more than people that do not live in those institutions? Interesting. Very interesting. Who in Scripture has an I problem? Isaiah 14 verse 12 and 14 to 14 says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will, I will, I will, I will. I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High." Who was it? Here's my question tonight to you. Is it possible that when Satan creates an injury in terms of our sense of self, and we become preoccupied with self, that he slowly starts to superimpose his ideology upon our life? We become super sensitive. We become like prickly pears. You know what prickly pears are? My brothers and sisters there from Zimbabwe knows exactly. As kids, we would often go and pick those prickly pears and would have to go home at night full of thorns, just rubbing our finger lightly over our clothes. We would scream with pain because of the thorns that are in our flesh. Have you seen those people that act exactly the same? Most probably, they've been injured. And maybe God has placed you intentionally in a place to help them towards healing by understanding yourself first and then reaching out to others. The effect of family stress, just two research theories, that the family systems theory consistently indicates that our family of origin remains with us. In other words, what has happened in our family of origin stays with us. Wherever we go, we carry with us unresolved emotional reactivity to our parents. Our vulnerability is disguised by our reactivity, and we repeat the same old patterns in new relationships. I had to come to my own children, and I had to go down on my knees to be on eye level with them and take them into my arms. And I had to say to them, my child, I am sorry, please forgive Dad. The way that I treated you was unkind. I treated them in the same way as what I was treated. I hated it as a child. I repeated it towards my own kids. From time to time, I pick up the phone and I phone my kids and I say to them, my child, they're both adults. Both of them are parents themselves now. But still I phone them and say, you're okay. It is me that battled with my own demons of my own past. Please forgive me for the way that I've treated you in the past. Another research, Sullivan's interpersonal theory suggests that we live in a reciprocal dynamic of interpersonal relationships. Their maladaptive behavior are often the mechanism they use to cope with their anxiety of interpersonal rejection. What's all those big words saying? It says that we are battling with the stuff that we have in our suitcases. My friends, tomorrow night, we're going to start taking it out and we're going to ask the question, does it really belong to me? Does the stuff that I carry in my suitcase really belongs to me? I want to just very briefly show you in closing how Jesus dealt with a man that lived with a broken sense of self. Mark chapter 10, verse 46 to 52. In verse 46 it says, now they came to Jericho, and as he went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great multitude, blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by this road begging. I want to just very briefly share with you that I don't believe that Jesus or that the book of Mark is trying to give us any indication of how long Jesus lingered in Jericho. But if I was Jesus, traveling by foot through the desert, coming into an oasis city, what would you have done? I'll tell you what I would have done. I would have kicked out my sandals. I would have gone and sat down in the shade of those palm trees, put my foot into the cool water of that fountain. I would have drunk myself to the full, and I would lay back and just relax. Jesus comes in and he goes out on the other side. It is as if there's something that is racing inside him, as if there's something intentional in him coming to Jericho. And as you go out on the other side, what do they find? Blind Bartimaeus. What does his name Bartimaeus mean? It is sometimes quite significant to look into the original language to find what it means. The Greek word Bartimaeus, Bar means son of, Timaeus, son of Timaeus. But Timaeus means a man living with ceremonially being unclean. In other words, a man who lives with shame. And he fits well. Because how did the Jews view a person that was born blind? They had it worked out to the T. You tell me your disease, and I'll tell you the sins that you've committed that have caused that disease. So if you had been born blind, who sinned? You or your parents? Remember Jesus' disciples asking that question? How would the church treat blind Bartimaeus? Can anyone tell me? They would shun him. Why would they shun him? Because it was his sins that led him into blindness. That was their belief. Was that the correct belief? It was the incorrect belief. But still they held on to that belief. So let's see what happens as Jesus walks past him. So here's a man that lives with sin. Verse 47, and when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out, saying, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Then many who warned him to be quiet, but he cried out the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Please note, my dear friends, he's the only one in that entire crowd that sees the messiahship of Jesus, Son of David. What does the next word say? So Jesus stood still. Did you get it? Did you get it? The footsteps of the creator of the universe is brought to a standstill by the cry of a man who lives with shame. What does shame mean? Checking to see whether you remembered yesterday. I gave you the definition. What does shame mean? It is a belief that I am defective. I don't measure up. I'll never be good enough. It means that I'm broken. I can never be mended. It is a sense that I can't measure up. The footsteps of the creator of the universe is brought to a standstill. In actual fact, the creator of the universe did not just rush into and through Jericho. He actually rushed through the corridors of space and time because he had a man who lives with shame in mind who was sitting just outside the gates of Jericho. My friend, is that person you? Is it you that is hoping that someone would say that you have worth and value? Let's continue. And I'll be quick. So Jesus stood still and commanded him to be called. Then they called the blind man, saying to him, Be of good cheer, rise, he's calling you. And throwing aside his garment, he rose and came to Jesus. Let's stop there. Throwing aside his garments. What does it mean? What does he still have on? If I throw aside my garments, what do I still have on? Nothing. Naked, he comes to Jesus. Oh, my friends, if you find yourself tonight as blind Bartimaeus, as a person that lives with shame, what you need to do is throw off every covering that you have used to try and make you seem as though you've got value and worth. That's what we do, don't we? We often see people that have a low sense of self-worth because of emotional injury, that they will act in a grandiose way. They will be the ones that laugh the loudest. They're the ones that criticize the most. They're the ones that bully the most. To hide their fear that others might see the brokenness inside. Throwing off. That is what we need to do. We need to come naked towards Jesus. So Jesus answered and said to him, What do you want me to do for you? Did Jesus know what he needed? So why does he ask a stupid question? Not a stupid question. It is a very important question, because if Jesus healed him without him recognizing his need, the healing would not be whole. We need to come to Jesus and say, Lord, if you can make something out of rubbish, Lord, then I want to give myself to you. Lord, I feel that though I can never gain the approval of someone else, I'll be never good enough. With my broken sense of self, I come to you to find myself in you. The blind man said to him, Rabboni, that I may receive my sight. Then Jesus said to him, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus on the road. One last research, and that's it. Still the Harvard Mastery of Stress study. They focused on the effect of someone other than parents caring and loving for someone else. Talking about you. There's someone in your church that is hurting. There is someone that is battling to know that they've got worth and value. Can you make a difference? What did they find? They found that even the perception of love itself may turn out to be a core, vital, psychosocial, spiritual buffer, reducing the negative impact of stresses and pathogens and promoting immune function and healing later in life. They did a research in Illinois, in America. Young people became delinquent. They started to do things against the law. They started to run into trouble with the law. They started to drink. They started to form gangs. They stopped going to school. And a group of older people in the community went to the police commander and said, give us an opportunity to do an experiment. He said, what do you want to do? They said to him, we just want to connect with these young people. Are you related to them? We don't know them from a bar of soap. We need a photograph on you and the name of every young person. Tell us where they hang out. There's nothing to lose, so the police commander said, okay, we'll do an experiment. He gave each one of the elderly people, each one a photograph of a young person with their name. He told them where they were hanging out. And the old people that were not related to these young people went to those locations. They identified the young person that they had on the photograph. They put the photograph in their pocket. They went up to the young person, and instead of going straight bang into them, they just went sideways past them. And as they passed the young person, they said, hi, Johnny. Johnny was standing there with his beer in his hand and his cigarette, and he was talking big stuff with his mates. And as the older person walked past, who's this old guy? And the old person just kept on walking. The following day, they were back again. And he came up to Johnny, and he just brushed past Johnny and said, hey, you Johnny. By the third day, as the older person came up to Johnny, he flicked away the cigarette, the beer bottle went behind his back. Within a few short months, all of those young people were back at school. Why? It seemed as though someone was caring about them. That is the need of the people of your day. Knowing that someone cares. They cannot believe that God cares, not before someone in their community, in their family, cares about them. Will you be that person? Or are you tonight that person that needs to be cared for Are you broken? And Jesus says, what is it that I can do for you? Tomorrow night I'm going to give you a second model and show you the Hebrew model of how God actually answers our need for self. And then I'm going to give you a formula for change. May God bless you. I think we've just going to close with prayer. We won't have any further song. And may God bless you. And we'll see you tomorrow night. We start exactly on 7:30. Let's pray together. Gracious Heavenly Father, maybe tonight some hearts were touched. Maybe for the first time, words were given to people for that which they have been battling for so long. But as I shared my story, most probably their own brain was racing ahead, trying to sift through their own memories, trying to make sense of who they are. Father, as we gather tomorrow, may we find direction. May we find answers. May we discover who we are from a Hebrew model. If there's anyone tonight, Lord, that feels that they hold no worth and no value, not even value enough to be loved by you, I pray that in their brokenness, that they might consider that maybe there is a God that had so much compassion that he left heaven and came through the corridors of space and time just for them, just for a time like this. And as they ponder that,